Chapter 8. There were 7 of them, and they were flying so low that he might have reached up and pulled one of them down. He was standing just outside the snow entrance to the cabin when he heard a soft, irregular clapping. Then they were upon him, 7 gleaming white snow geese with black wing tips, 7 hurtling bodies swerving away at the last moment to gain altitude as they pumped northward in a tight V, 1 bird in the lead and 3 stepping back on each flank. He sent a long, ringing cheer after them. "Ah, the lovely brave geese!" he cried out. "Welcome, welcome back!" The sight of the birds filled his heart with hope. With the exception of a solitary gull, they were the only sign of life he had seen in months. To celebrate their arrival, he went back inside the cabin, drew a half cup of rum for himself, and cut a large piece of whale meat for Nancy. Then he and Nancy went outside and sat on top of the exposed keel of the ship. Allan sipped the rum. He felt like dancing. It was so good to see other forms of life again. And in the days that followed, wild ducks and Canada geese flew over on their way to the northern nesting grounds. Night after night, the fulmars and arctic terns and kittiwakes made the skies hum with the beat of their wings. Soon the ice beneath the Ann Forbes was constantly growling and crackling. One day, afraid that the ice might suddenly loosen and the Ann Forbes go down, Allan shifted his living quarters to the top of the iceberg. Not many days later he saw a ribbon of clear water to the south and realized that the winter ice was breaking up. It was too late now to try and reach land. For the next 6 months, his only hope of getting off the iceberg would be if he were spotted by a whaling ship. One night soon after, as Allan was sleeping in his cave room on the iceberg peak, he felt the whole ice mountain give a violent tilt. The sudden movement jolted him awake, and he sat up and lit the lamp. Nancy had also awakened, and he looked over at her and asked, "Well, lass, if the whole berg turns bottom up, what are we going to do?" Nancy had no interest in the matter. Sitting down, she lazily scratched the underside of her chin with a front paw. Or has the Ann Forbes broken loose and finally gone to the bottom? But whatever had happened, for the moment there was nothing Allan could do. He would not take a chance on going down his ice stairway in the dark. For the next hour or so there were several smaller shakes and lifting movements, but finally all was still again. As soon as there was enough light in the morning, Allan went to the door of his cave and looked out. The iceberg had broken loose from the surrounding ice pan, and already a channel of clear water showed on one side of the berg. Further out, the whole ice field was breaking up with thousands of floes bobbing up and down in the water. Worried about the Ann Forbes, Allan hurried down to the bottom of the ice mountain and made his way over to the ship. Although the Ann Forbes was still locked in the grip of the ice, open water could be seen just a few feet beyond the upturned keel. It was at this moment Allan realized that the ship had to be resting on an underwater ledge of the iceberg. Perhaps, he thought, the Ann Forbes was not doomed after all. Perhaps she might stay put throughout the whole summer. In the meantime, Nancy had spotted the open water on the other side of the Ann Forbes. She galloped off in that direction, and Allan followed her. When Nancy reached the edge of the water, she slid in head first and disappeared. Allan waited at the lip of the iceberg. Nancy was under for so long that he began to worry. Just about when he decided that something had happened to his pet, Nancy's sleek head broke the surface of the water. She had a fish in her mouth. She swam over and laid it on the ice in front of Allan. The fish, a large Arctic char, flopped a couple of times, and Allan put his foot down on top of it. Then he reached over and patted Nancy on the head. "Oh, you're a good wee lass. That's it. Now fetch another." A swirl of water and Nancy was gone again. In the next half hour she caught a dozen fish. Allan fed half of them to Nancy and took the rest home and cleaned and gutted them. He had a fresh fish for dinner that night, and it tasted delicious. Strangely enough, on a vessel that worked in some of the richest fishing grounds in the world, Allan had not been able to find even one fish hook. He had no trouble freezing and storing the fish. He hollowed out a small square area in one of the ice walls of his cave and stuck the fish in there. For the rest of the summer, as long as there was open water nearby, Nancy caught more than enough for both of them. The extra fish he cleaned and froze for later. She also tried to catch seals that came up to sunbathe on the iceberg, but these sleek animals were too quick and wary for her, and could easily outswim Nancy in the water. Walrus sometimes came to the berg, but Nancy was too small yet to tackle a full-grown walrus. There was still plenty of loose ice in the open sea, and indeed Allan was never to see the water completely free of ice floes or icebergs, even in the middle of summer. And although his ice island now floated completely on its own, free of any ice fields, it was still at the mercy of ocean tides and winds and currents. And so the iceberg moved now one way and now another. Allan's biggest worry was that the ledge of ice on which the Ann Forbes rested would break off the main body of the iceberg. If that happened, he would lose the ship. It was mainly for this reason that he moved so much food and supplies to his cave on top of the ice mountain. However, as the summer wore on, he grew more confident that the underwater ledge would hold, that the Ann Forbes would stay where she was. Indeed, on one or two occasions during bad storms, Allan slept on the ship rather than in his ice cave. Another of Allan's worries was that the iceberg would drift to the south, reaching warmer water, and rapidly melt. However, he soon realized that the iceberg did not drift in any one direction for very long, and while it often drifted south for a day or two, the berg was just as likely to drift west or even north. Early one morning, when the summer was well advanced, Allan woke up and, following his usual custom, went immediately outside to the ice platform to search the surrounding sea for the sign of a sail. The first thing he noticed was a long, low ridge on the western horizon. Was it land or another iceberg? For a moment he cursed the captain for having brought his spyglass up on deck just before the Ann Forbes hit. And anyway, what kind of captain sailed with only one telescope? All day Allan anxiously watched the black line to the west. By nightfall it had definitely grown larger and had taken on the appearance of a body of land. Allan even fancied he could see a shingled beach. He was so excited that he hardly slept at all that night. Long before sunrise he was out on the observation platform, waiting. As the night blue paled into gray, the outline of land gradually became firm. When it was fully light, he saw that the iceberg had drifted to within less than a mile of a large body of land. Looking at the high, dark stone cliffs across from the berg, watching water break on a low shingled beach at the foot of the cliff, Allan began to curse his stupidity in not having made a small boat or raft of some kind. By noon he was positive that the berg's drift was no longer toward land. He knew, or guessed, that the iceberg was 100 feet deep below the waterline and was probably now hung up on the shallow bottom that shelved out from the land. But without a boat of some kind, that mile might as well be 100. In mid-afternoon he spotted movement on the beach. A dark, bulky figure that he took to be an Eskimo woman was gathering something from the rocks. As soon as she looked over, Allan stood up on the platform outside his cave and cupped his hands around his mouth. Then he cut loose with the loudest roar that he could manage. "Hello! Hello!" The woman looked up and over at the iceberg. At that moment Nancy came out of the cave and, imitating her beloved master, stood up on her hind legs and also let out a loud roar. The woman promptly turned around and ran away as fast as she could. "Come back!" Allan shouted. In less than a minute, the running figure was lost to sight. Allan sank down and buried his head in his hands. Nancy had obviously terrified the woman out of her wits. He might hope that she had gone for help, but it was obvious that she had been badly frightened. Allan did not know it, of course, but it was probable that the woman mistook him for a polar bear, as he often wore his bear rug around his shoulders as a cape. She had probably set off for her village to tell the male hunters that she had seen 2 polar bears. Polar bears were a great source of meat for Eskimos, and they hunted them at every opportunity. Allan kept a close watch on the beach for the rest of the afternoon, but no one else showed up. Toward nightfall, the wind shifted, and the berg began to drift out to sea again. The next morning, the empty sea stretched away on every side of the ice island. Allan took a long look around, then went down to the Ann Forbes and retired to his sleeping closet. He did not want to go outside, even to take a look around. Why bother? There was nothing out there anyway. He stayed several days in his closet, and might have stayed even longer had it not been for Nancy. During the 3rd day, she began to whimper for him, and he finally had to get up and reassure her that nothing was wrong. Even though something was, for he was very afraid now that he would never get off the iceberg alive.